dive into our conversation with James Farr. He is a journalist with the Los Angeles Progressive, but also an independent journalist known for The Conversation Live. James Farr, good morning.
Good morning, Dominique. How are you? Thanks so much for having me back on.
Yeah, thanks for checking in and for your great coverage of that civil case in Tampa, Florida, where we were watching the family of Andrew Joseph III go after justice for their son 8 years after his death, 8.5 years really. Finally got their day in court, and they got a victory, a massive victory. I understand one of the most, if not the largest payouts in the history of the state of Florida for law enforcement responsibility for a death.
Absolutely, and that's what's being reported right now, Dominique. You know, the family were demanding $30 million, and the jury unanimously came back with an award of just about $15 million on last Thursday in Tampa courtroom.
And it didn't take long. I mean, they weren't deliberating that long, right?
About 2.5 hours, possibly. I mean, by the time closing arguments concluded, a lunch break happened. Somewhere about an hour and a half after that lunch break, we learned that there was a question sent back to the attorneys, and the family was summoned back into the courtroom, and they were awaiting to hear the verdict from the jury.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we're kind of working backwards here because we've been tracking this case throughout. You have, but I do want to kind of take the journey of the story because just now we have all the pieces put together. But before we do that, talk to me about the reaction from the family and all of those activists. I mean, you had justice families, tons of justice families, you had clergy, you had local activist groups, and then Black Lives Matter chapter representatives from across the country, Black Lives Matter grassroots. Tell me what the reaction was like when that decision came.
First of all, Dominique, the family did not immediately know that a verdict was in. And so standing outside of the courtroom, I just happened to be present when Andrew learned from his attorney that we had a verdict. And that was a moment, you could almost feel the energy in his body, right? This was the moment that this family was waiting for the last 8.5 years. And because the verdict came after the court hours, and it was closed, they did not allow a full gallery to witness or hear the reading of the verdict. So it was a very intimate group of family. There were members of Black Lives Matter grassroots, as well as you mentioned, some of those justice families, as well as the press. I sat next to Dr. Abdullah. I sat next to the grandmother, Miss Mary, and it came this moment when the judge told the courtroom that you have to take the verdict. And that was, as I would later learn after talking with Andrew and Deanna, that was just the most surreal moment kind of in this process. They were holding hands. Everyone was holding hands. There was prayers in the courtroom. Outside of the courtroom, we're now 7 floors up. You could hear, and mind you, the activists outside did not know that a verdict was in, but Sister Portia out of Atlanta was leading a chant, "I believe that we will win." And jury comes into the courtroom. The judge asks, "Is this their verdict?" They read the verdict, and you know, you have to stay composed inside of the courtroom, but it was just the most joyous occasion, and the family just hugged. There was crying, there was just joy, and then out the courtroom doors downstairs to a crowd of supporters who greeted them excuse me, in the most welcoming and celebratory way imaginable. It was just a beautiful thing to bear witness to.
Yeah, and you know, as soon as you hear a question coming back from the jury, you can start worrying, right? You can start saying, well, maybe there's a holdout, maybe, there's some lack of understanding, especially with this jury, because we didn't have anybody black on the jury. Do you think, did it seem like the family was nervous, concerned, worried when they were waiting for that information, that verdict to come back?
I don't think so, and the reason why I say that, because the question that came back had to do with the second claim that the jury would have to decide on, which was the Fourth Amendment issue. Was the young Joseph lawfully seized during the fair? And so I don't think it really worried them much. Perhaps if it were a question about the negligence, which the family maintained that was their entire case on the parts of the Hillsborough County Sheriffs, it perhaps would have set in a little bit differently. But no doubt it was still a moment of anxiety and angst for the family because they just did not know.
Right. So, I mean, this is a huge victory for the family. Of course, it won't bring back Andrew Joseph III, but I think to put it in context, we can just summarize kind of this journey. I mean, because for us, for many of people who are tracking the case now, they haven't necessarily been following it all along. So for the family, it's been 8.5 years of struggle, organizing, and pressing against this concept of qualified immunity.
Absolutely. Qualified immunity, which is a legal doctrine, it's not actually even a codified law, but it's this ideal that affords police officers a shield of immunity from taking responsibility or accountability if, in fact, they've done something that, would be outside of the law. But at each step of the way, the Hillsborough County Sheriffs have used this as a way to block this family from getting their day in court. And one of the things that is important to highlight, it was of paramount importance to the family, especially the dad, right? Because his name too is Andrew Joseph. And so when Mr. Joseph Jr. took the stand, he made sure that he wanted his father's name, his name, and most importantly, his son's name cleared. Because what the sheriff's department did after this absolutely preventable tragic incident was they criminalized this 14-year-old boy. And that was something that, money will never replace, but the dignity and the respect to number 5, as we came to learn about him in the community, or Pee-wee, or how he was loved and revered by his peers. That was important to that family.
Yeah, I heard the same from Deanna Joseph, Andrew Joseph III's mom. It seemed like a higher priority for them than the money was about clearing their son's name, clearing their family name. And of course you want accountability. Of course you want, you want them to pay, even though the deputies are not personally liable. But it seemed like clearing their good name and the name of their child was the top priority for this family.
Absolutely. And that was one of Joseph Jr., Mr. Joseph Andrews' first comments coming out of the courtroom. That was so important to him. And, when we think, we say their names all the time, right, Dominic, when we're kind of out in community, but it's a little bit different for impacted families and relationship. You have Mr. Joseph, whose son is his namesake. So in saying he is saying himself. And so it just lands a little bit differently in terms of it's a tragedy to lose a child. What he described and how he and his family are still trying to put the pieces back together. It's almost, as he described to me, once a man, twice a child. So they're starting over. And they're trying to rebuild relationship with their youngest daughter and only daughter, their remaining child, because she was just a young girl and she had to live with her family and kind of be in space. And so it's important that this family be allowed to just heal, rest, and enjoy the moment but there's still a fight ahead.
Right, and we'll talk about the fight ahead, but also the journey to get to where we are today, to this incredible victory after news, traffic, and sports. And I really do feel for the daughter. I remember when my sister was murdered, just how my father and his wife, Amina, and all of us really, but especially them because they're the hub of the family. It's just unimaginable, the stress, the change, the emotional impact, that it changes you forever. And so to have that happen to your parents when you're a young child has got to be insanely impactful. And I pray for her, because it's a long road to recovery that doesn't go away overnight. We've got news, traffic, and sports now. Then we're going to talk with James Farr about the journey to justice for Andrew Joseph III. It's KBLA Talk 1580.
This is KBLA Talk 1580, where we turn red lights to green lights and keep it moving. Amplifying progressive voices for KBLA Talk 1580.
Talking with James Farr of The Conversation Live and the LA Progressive. And James was there in Tampa covering this civil case brought by the family of Andrew Joseph III. So let's rewind. I just want to go back 8.5 years. We're going to do this quick, though, because I want to give people a sense of what happened, if you haven't pieced together all the pieces, where we are now, and what's next. I've said it many times, but I think I'm hoping that this story is going to start being told nationally, not just on KBLA, and also that we, the regular folks, will track this and say his name and do everything we can to end qualified immunity to help make sure that this kind of justice delay doesn't plague other families. So let's just recap really quickly what happened that day at the fair and what it took to get that day in court.
Absolutely. On February 7th, 2014, the young 14-year-old Andrew Joseph was attending a Florida State Fair on Youth Day. And within 45 minutes to an hour of arriving at the fair, he was essentially snatched up by Corporal Deputy Mark Clark. The deputy alleged that Andrew was running on what's called the Midway, but there was no evidence presented in court to even back that up. But what we do know is that what the young Andrew was doing after seeing his friend be body slammed by another officer and his hat falling off, the young Joseph went over to pick up the hat and was snatched up. Immediately, he was detained. He was put into custody. He was placed into a dark van and driven to a remote location that they allegedly say is an ejection point, and basically turned out to go find his way to the other side of the state fair, which was well over 2 miles to get to the gate to where he actually would have been picked up. An officer told him that if he and his 12-year-old companion re-entered the fairgrounds, that they would be arrested. That sent the Joseph off onto a trajectory of him trying to navigate how to get back to his ride. He was a very responsible young man, and he crossed a very busy interstate once, and then on the second time, he was struck by a motorist. That motorist was not detained, breathalyzed. He was allowed to go on his merry way, and the young Joseph subsequently died as a result of the fatal crash on that interstate. And so for the last 8 years, the family has been endeavoring to get a day in court, and last week we saw the conclusion of that court trial, and it was a victory for the family.
It was a huge victory for the family, but it was also a victory for activists on the ground. And so while much of the nation has been distracted with the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, inflation, keeping the lights on and food on the table, the activists in Black Lives Matter, which are, many of them actually, are justice families who have turned to Black Lives Matter to help galvanize their resolve to make change, have continued what we were calling in 2020 a racial reckoning, have continued that work. Just because it's not on CNN doesn't mean it's not going on. So when we talk about ending qualified immunity, the story that you described, what happened to Andrew Joseph III, which is basically every parent's nightmare, it happened 8.5 years ago, and they've been fighting ever since that February 7th, 2014 day to get some kind of accountability. What does that fight look like?
That fight looked like as I said, appeals and filing motions and going through 8.5 years until they were able to get to this very point. And so some of the decisions that the judge made, I mean, this now sets a precedent. It is now case law, and immediately the rulings that were made throughout this case can be applicable to others who are in a similar situation. And that was also something that was very important for the Joseph family, as well as activists. But as you said earlier, I mean, I'm so grateful to the KBLA family, you, Dominique, Dr. Mel, and Brother Travis for sharing this platform and allowing me to tell this story on a larger platform, because we need our community to know what's happening in these courtrooms. And we need to tell these stories. So while we're distracted by those other things, folks need to know about the Andrew Joseph case out of Florida, as you mentioned earlier, resulted in the largest settlement in the state's history, resulting from an officer involved in misconduct.
Yeah, it sends a strong message, and I think that I think it's also important in a sense. I mean, it would have been nice to have some black people on the jury, but the fact that there's nobody black on this jury and it still comes back swiftly as a $15 million verdict sends a strong message. And this is coming from the state of Florida, where Trayvon Martin's death ultimately led to no accountability, and which was a spark for much of the movement that we have today as far as Black Lives Matter and anti-racist movement, the modern version. So there's a lot about this case that I think is important symbolically, that hopefully will fuel the opportunity for others to get justice and maybe save some lives. I mean, hopefully the fact that there's some accountability here, even though it's not personal accountability for these deputies, will give some folks pause.
Absolutely. You know, and it's important to point out that the young Joseph did not do anything wrong. He did not do anything illegal. It is not against even the fair rules to run. Children run at a fair, right? But more importantly, what we saw in the courtroom was the expert witness lean into the jury and tell them, this is how we do things in Florida. The deputies had a duty under statute. Once they took the young Joseph into custody, once they had detained him, they had a duty to notify his parents. And the Joseph attorneys pointed out that the young Joseph was not lucky enough to be arrested. He was unlucky in the sense that he had been turned out onto the highway and left to fend for himself with a very young companion. So it's so important to point out that there was an attempt to avert the law, right? Like, we don't have to follow the law, and we're reading the statute right there in court. So I don't know how the jury could have ignored that, but you best believe it is Florida, and they tried at every turn to sully this young man's name and kill the plaintiff's case.
Right. I mean, the judge in the case seemed like she ran a pretty tight ship. To me, one of my takeaways from this case is the importance of paying attention to who the judges are.
Absolutely. Judge Mary Skirvin, who I don't know a whole lot about, but what I can tell you is that was someone's grandmama. if I can get in the culture, right? That was Big Mama up on the stand, and she ran a tight courtroom. She allowed the defense to throw everything they had to throw at her, because what she wanted to do when she ruled, she wanted it to be an ironclad decision. She was fair. She also allowed the defense to get some other things in, but she ruled that courtroom in the most equitable way imaginable, and it was a much benefit for the Joseph family that Judge Skirvin was on the bench in this particular case. I could clearly see how things could go differently.
I mean, she was an African-American woman judge, seemed to be no nonsense, but also seemed very fair in terms of, like you said, allowing the defense to do everything but breakdance to make their case without providing a cover or providing, what we've seen in some of these other police accountability cases of judges hugging and coddling law enforcement. I think she appears to have struck a balanced, which is what we want from our judges, approach. So for me, it was inspiration for all of us to read up on the judges that are on the ballot in November. We're talking with James Farr. Want to look at what is next, because the organizing continues after this incredible victory, a $15 million verdict for the family of Andrew Joseph III in Tampa, Florida on Friday. It's KBLA Talk 1580.
More of First Things First with Dominique DePrima when we come forward.
Survival of the fit, only the strong.
As we continue our mission to fill the void and provide relevant programming and content to our community, get ready for the KBLA Talk 1580 exclusive series, Agenda for America, an African-American perspective, coming this fall. 4 consecutive weeks, 4 all-star panels, 4 essential conversations. Every Thursday in October, live from Los Angeles, KBLA Talk 1580 will unpack the state of black women in America, the state of black men in America, the state of black youth in America, and conclude with Why We Can't Wait, a conversation about the urgency of now. What we do in the days, weeks, and months ahead is more consequential than ever before. These 4 conversations will focus on the future of our democracy and whether or not we meet the moment. Download the KBLA 1580 app right now for exclusive alerts about Agenda for America, an African-American perspective. Coming to KBLA Talk 1580 this fall.
Survival of the fit, only strong survive.
Your ancestors' favorite radio station, and your favorite morning show host. Let's get back to Dominique DePrima right now.
Right now we're talking with James Farr, the Conversation Live in the LA Progressive, and just recapping and really taking a look, now that we have the time and the hindsight to do so, at the civil case of the family of Andrew Joseph III as they have been seeking justice for their son. As you said, there's been a lot of celebration. At the same time, the organizing continues. They have said throughout that ending qualified immunity is a priority. So what are the next steps?
In speaking with the activists on the ground, the next steps are to contact your local Congress representative and ask them to sign on to Massachusetts Congress member Ayanna Pressley's bill, which is trying to get through the Congress and into qualified immunity. I mean, it's an old doctrine. It's very draconian, and in spite of what opponents of ending qualified immunity would say, is that if you eliminate it, no one is going to work into law enforcement. So again, that's another dog whistle. There needs to be some accountability for these officers and their actions, and that is something that all of the activists collectively agree on. Supporting the Andrew Joseph Foundation would be another thing that folks can do, and also if they want to continue to tap in with Black Lives Matter grassroots to stay up to date on the work and how an individual can actually be involved with the work that they're doing on the ground. Those are 3 great steps that your listeners can do right now.
And we're going to hear a lot more about this, I believe. It's odd, though, because although this is a priority, should be a priority, because qualified immunity, as you pointed out in an earlier conversation, is not a law. It's a doctrine, meaning just a philosophy, but that one that has permeated, these kinds of cases across the nation. But I also remember clearly that one of the huge sticking points for the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act and the Breathe Act, which never went anywhere beyond the House of Representatives, was qualified immunity. Republicans were just not willing to back away from it, modify it, or even really discuss it. Like, really, they weren't even willing to go into negotiation around this. So I wonder what the chances are for Ayanna Pressley. Of course, she's a progressive Democrat. Even if it passed the House of Representatives, would once again be stuck in the Senate. But so it seems like a long shot, but yet the family and the community activists that are standing with them are adamant that we have to move forward with this. How do you see it?
I've never seen the righteous forsaken, and whatever I thought was a long shot 2 weeks ago, I've reshifted what I believe is possible, because walking into a Florida courtroom, I had my doubts, and so I believe in terms of, if the organizers continue to mount that pressure that they have, if your listeners continue to mount pressure, if they contact their congressperson, right, whether or not it gets through the House and then on to the Senate is a matter of procedure and process. We don't have enough time to unpack police unions and associations and getting the money out of politics. That's a whole nother conversation, and why our electeds are afraid to even challenge law enforcement associations. But I believe if we as a people, it's important that we hear this positive story, right? In this moment, it's a positive story, but we have to continue to stay vigilant. We have to listen to KBLA, and if you choose to listen or write or follow the stuff that I'm writing, that's a great step too, right? But we have to stay informed. We have to get our electeds to push this legislation through. It's time to end it. These officers have, in many cases, little to no accountability.
James Farr, we will find out how to follow that work of yours and your big takeaway from your couple weeks there in Florida when we come forward on KBLA Talk 1580.
Courage is contagious. We're KBLA Talk 1580. Curiosity is more important than intelligence. We've got both. Now celebrating 1 year being your trusted truth teller. You're listening to KBLA Talk 1580.
And speaking of truth-telling, you do quite a bit of that at the LA Progressive. And in all of your work, James, remind us how we can track what you're doing.
Twitter, James Farr Live. Facebook, James Farr Live. Google, James Farr Live. LA Progressive, LAProgressive.com.
LAProgressive.com. LA Progressive covers quite a range of topics for people who are trying to stay up on what is going on around the world and locally as well. What would you say in a couple minutes here was the main takeaway for you, or the main big impression that you got after spending almost 2 weeks on the ground there in Tampa covering this story?
Absolutely, and that's what I'm going to be writing about in the next week or so, is really the sense of community. The facts that happen in the courtroom are just that, and they're well published, and I'll include a part of that. But what I really want to center is the experience of the families and the time that I was able to spend with the justice families, and how each one of them are coming into this space individually, but they leave collectively healed. You have some fathers and mothers who this is still fresh for them, and it's just this crazy thing to even discuss, right? Like, you're new to the party, you just lost a loved one last year, right? And then there's the other side, is someone that's lost someone years ago. And so one of the things that I saw, or several of the things I saw, was the love, support, and the healing out there with those families. I saw the justice system actually work, right? And I want folks to sit with that. I saw the justice system work. And lastly, as they say in movement and in community, when we fight, we win. So our community has to stay vigilant and persistent and continue the fight. It's a beautiful struggle, but once you're woke, it's hard to sleep, and we have to continue to tell these stories. So I'm, again, thankful for you for allowing me to share what's happening, and the Joseph family especially for embracing me and allowing me with such access to really get to see them and know them in one of the most vulnerable spaces and states that anyone could ever be in.
Yeah, it's true. The justice system worked with a big push from Black Lives Matter grassroots, justice families, clergy, folks on the ground, and journalists like yourself. The justice system worked with a giant nudge, and I'm so pleased that it did. James Farr, thank you for joining us today and throughout the previous weeks.
Thank you, Dominique, for having me. You have a great day.
You as well. We've got news, we've got traffic, we've got sports, and then we're going to